especially the new folks who are training to learn about our team and hopefully join us. Is this on?
You hold it close.
Yeah,
Like a diva.
yeah.
Okay. So whenever we do this kind of training, and when we do interventions in churches, one of our primary goals is to create a safe space for everyone. Safety really allows people to be able to open up and share their personal stories, and it also enables them to shift perspective more easily. They're more open to learning when they're feeling safe, and so that's a very important part of what we do. You'll hear more about that as we talk to you about our processes. But given the statistics on sexual violation in our culture, we know that many people have been affected by and wounded by these kinds of experiences. So it is common for conversations around these topics to trigger people. As a therapist, I have been observing over the past couple of months, as all of the publicity about the abuse in the Catholic Church has come to the forefront, how many of my clients have been triggered and affected by all of the publicity about this. People who are experiencing increased anxiety, anger, numbness, all kinds of responses that are common trauma responses as a result of the publicity. So we just, knowing that these kinds of conversations can trigger people who've had any kind of history of sexual violation, we want to be respectful of everyone and encourage you to take care of yourselves. And one of the ways that we do that is by creating a room, which we've established here in the church. It's down the hall to my left, at the end of the hall. It's the youth room, 107, wasn't it? Where if anyone is feeling either overwhelmed or distressed, or maybe you just need a break from the intensity of the discussion, you can go there and just take a little break. And if you would like to talk to any of us who have been trained in treating trauma, please let us know. They're on the established team right now. That's me and Janet and Amanda and Donna. So if you have any concerns and you'd like to talk with someone, please feel free to ask for that kind of help. And I just want to make sure that you know we do the same kind of thing when we are meeting with a congregation. We create the same kind of safety arrangements for persons in congregations. Announcements are made and people aren't even expecting, they don't even know what the announcement is. They're likely to be surprised, taken by surprise, and when you're not prepared for a conversation like this, it's all the more likely that you might experience some kind of triggering reaction. So we just always want to make sure that people have everything they need to feel safe.
I'm going to begin actually not talking about the policy, but we'll get there. I'm going to begin by sharing a story about how all of this began. So I have kind of a script because it helps me to remember, because it really did begin back in 1991. So my first experience with the congregation where the pastor had been engaged in sexual misconduct began in November of that year, when I was asked to fill in for a clergy colleague who was on a family in crisis leave. Now this was a colleague who was in my ordination class, so I knew him not super well, but I certainly knew him. And I knew some of the struggles that he was having in his marriage, because he talked about that when we had our kind of small group stuff as clergy going through the process. So I wasn't shocked or surprised to hear there was a crisis in his family. I started out being asked to preach for 3 weeks in this congregation and ended up there for 8 months. And I had another full-time job, but that's how it goes. So I was there for 5 months. It wasn't until March of 1992 that I really found out the true story. By then, my colleague had surrendered his credentials in good standing, which happened in January of 1992. And the SPRC chair had made that announcement in worship that Sunday. In March, I was invited to go to a training in Nashville put on by Marie Fortune. And it had to do with working with adults who've been sexually abused as children. And I just happened to mention that to a woman in that congregation who was the church organist. And she said to me, "When you come back from that training, I would like to talk with you." And my first thought was something must have happened to her when she was young in the church. So I went to the training, I came back, and found out that she had been having a sexual affair with that pastor for 2 years that he initiated. And what caused his crisis was she broke the affair off. This information came directly from her, not from anybody else in the hierarchy of the church. So I immediately called the district superintendent to share this information, only to be told, "Oh, we knew that." I was, I just could not believe that I had been pastoring in this church where these people were beating themselves up, thinking they had caused their pastor to have a nervous breakdown, which is kind of what he was telling them, when that wasn't what was really going on. The members of the congregation they were in crisis. And nobody was addressing the real issue of what was happening. There was no team, there was no policy, there was no one for me to talk to, except one other clergy person who also happened to be a psychiatrist. And I would call her and say, "Heidi, help." And she would say, "Well, here's some suggestions of what to do." I had some training, but because it was not being recognized at the cabinet and bishop level in terms of something, there was no way to address it or deal with it. And there was no way to bring justice or healing or even talk about it at that point. Within the next month or so, I learned that 3 other women in that congregation had been victimized in some way by this pastor prior to his being in crisis. And so again, went back to the bishop, to the district superintendents, and to some people on the board of the Orange Age Ministry saying, something needs to happen. Something needs to be done. These folks they're just traumatized. They don't know how to deal with what's going on, and they don't know the truth about what really happened. I wasn't allowed to talk to anyone. By then, they'd already announced who the newly appointed pastor was going to be. I was not allowed to talk to him, or they said, "No, you can't talk to him." So finally, there was some official action taken as this process unfolded, and the surrender of credentials went from in good standing to the accurate withdrawn under complaint. In the very last week of June, which for those of you who know the appointment system, that's when the change of pastors happened, my very last weekend to be there, on Saturday, the bishop and the district superintendent came to meet with people from the congregation and the staff parish committee. So they started out with a meeting in the morning with the staff parish committee. And then in the afternoon, people from the congregation were invited to a congregational meeting. There was some disclosure to the staff parish about what really had happened. I don't think it was a full disclosure, but at least some disclosure so that they began to understand that the pastor did not have a nervous breakdown, but there had been an affair with someone in the congregation. And then in the big congregational meeting, the bishop's comments did not promote healing, and in fact, he defended and praised the pastor for his wonderful skills, and I think re-victimized everyone sitting in that room, including any other victims who may not have yet come forward. And again, I felt very powerless because I had been pretty silenced in terms of being able to address the congregation. So finally, when the new pastor began, I did have about an hour's conversation with him and the new district superintendent, because there was also a change of superintendents. I went and talked to the DS to share my concerns, to say, these people are still in pain, and there's nobody helping them talk about it. There's nobody helping them process what's happened to them as a congregation. So finally, that fall, I was allowed to go back to have some conversation with whoever would show up. And I'm pretty sure by that time, Sharon Spencer went with me. It's kind of hard to remember because that was a long time ago. But very few people came. In my notes that I was keeping at the time, I wrote, it was really too late to do anything effective. Mostly these folks are angry with the new pastor. They were displacing all of that anger that was not being expressed onto the new pastor who walked into this situation blind. And he did not have the skills. He was not the right person to go into that congregation. And literally at the end of that conference year, he left that congregation in a wheelchair. His health had been so compromised because of the conflict and because of all this anger that was being directed at him unfairly. And he just didn't have the training skills or understanding to know how to cope with it. So out of all of this, you heard some folks say they were tasked to write a policy. So this group from COSRO, Commission on Status and Role of Women, and so they began to write a policy in 1992, and they revised it and revised it and revised it, and I think, according to my notes, in 1995, it was finally approved. So the very first sexual misconduct policy was in place. It has since been updated and rewritten, and the most recent version was approved in 2012, and that is the policy that we are still using. Let's see. By then, I was involved in my second situation in dealing with the aftermath of a pastor's sexual misconduct and all of the devastation that it brought to a different church, this time in Selinsgrove. And we finally had a few other people, and some had mentioned about they had gone to some training to work with these kinds of situations. So when I got the call from that DS saying, we have a situation and we know you have some experience, would you please, and I was working a part-time parish. So they readjusted my worship schedule with that church so that I could preach at that church and then immediately drive down the road and go to the church in Selinsgrove. And I was there for about 6 months. But I wasn't there alone. And I was informed up front that the pastor had had an affair with someone in the church. And the reason the pastor left was because the woman's husband found out and threatened to kill the pastor. So it was a little better. I can't say it was great, but it was at least a little better. And I know that Wendy and Sharon and a couple of other folks were there to help address things with the congregation. We had some congregational meetings. And so it was a step above. And there was more conversation. The district superintendent and bishop came and they did address the congregation and it went better. It still wasn't great, but it went better. And then the bishop decided to create the response team. And so named members to be on this response team. And we revised the sexual ethics policy. By now it's 1998. So there was a protocol in place now to deal with the next situation. But it wasn't until another 2 years and a change of bishops that we actually began being utilized as a response team. And Mike on the cabinet was quite an advocate for that. So the cabinet also had to learn. You know, it wasn't just the bishop. It was also the cabinet, the district superintendents, who had to learn the value of what it would be to have a response team. So after a couple of more cases happened and the response team actually was activated and went in and began to follow our protocol, it became clear that our presence really was very much a healing presence. It was very helpful to the people who'd been victimized. It was very helpful to the cabinet as they dealt with the situations. Sometimes members of the congregation took a little longer to understand that we were there to help them. Sometimes the anger got displaced onto us as team members, and that still does happen. But eventually, most of the time, in most of the situations, people did understand that healing was possible and that we were helpful in that process, because that's the goal, to come in and heal all parties involved, including the person who was doing the sexual misconduct. That didn't often happen, but at least that was part of our goal. Now the Susquehanna Conference has a response team. We're about 25 strong, I think, in terms of members, to go into congregations. We've got the convener who coordinates. You'll hear a lot more about the process. We've got clergy and laity, we've got men and women, lots of varieties of skills and experiences. Many of us have been to subsequent training, and we do all of that. And again, June 2012 was the revised policy. So everyone who comes into the conference, who is part of the conference, as soon as they begin to serve a church, whether they're an elder, a deacon, a certified lay minister, a licensed local pastor, they have to have boundaries training within the first 6 months. That's a requirement because of the policy, and you'll hear more about that. And that all came, again, out of this whole experience of this is how not to do it. We're going to teach you how to do it well. And one of the things that's really important about having standardized training is if a situation ever goes to trial, and we've had 2 situations that I'm aware of that went to the initial stages of trial. One of them was settled before it actually got to the full trial, but one did go. We had one church trial in this conference, and I was called on to testify about what that pastor had learned in boundaries trainings. And because we had done the boundaries trainings and it was standardized, and because that pastor had a certificate saying that he had participated in the boundaries training, it made things go much more smoothly throughout the trial because we had done our due diligence as a conference. And so that pastor ended up being convicted and out of ministry because we had done things right and because we had the protocol and we followed it. And so that's a really important piece of the things that happen. In the past 18 years, the United Methodist Church has spent over $100 million adjudicating cases of clergy sexual misconduct across the denomination. 100 million, according to the research that I did. And that's only the cases we know about. In the Susquehanna Conference, there's been about 60 cases of some kind or another that have come in those 18 years, and we've never yet had a lawsuit that I'm aware of, and we've not had to pay out any money from that kind of a situation. There's other money we help with counseling and those kinds of things. But this comprehensive response to these allegations of sexual misconduct really means that we are also helping to prevent those kinds of lawsuits from happening. Now, that's not why we do it, but that's one of the good things that is an outcome when we do this kind of work. Oh, let's see. A comprehensive response to these allegations of sexual misconduct requires that 2 areas are addressed: the procedural justice that takes care of all the parties involved, and that can create tension when the individuals involved in the process itself don't always go real smoothly. And that's why we have a whole team, because it's more than 1 or 2 people that need to be working to address all of the issues that arise and work with all of the people who are affected. Because it's not just the person who has done the misconduct and whoever it is has been victimized, it's every other person in that congregation. It's also people in the wider community who know about that church and the reputation of that church and are affected by what's happened. And also every single clergy colleague, and also every single person in the conference, because it affects all of us. So the effective use of a response team lessens the potential of lawsuits, primarily because the person who has been victimized feels like somebody really cares about them. That's one of the most important things that we can do, is let them know how much we care and how sorry we are that they have been harmed. And that's one of the big messages that we're able to do. And that we do work to facilitate the healing of everyone involved. And we know this works. We've gotten lots and lots of feedback. And I want to share a few things about some of the feedback we've gotten from people who've been in this process. One of the women writes, "I don't know how I've been able to go on these past 6 months. I credit only the grace of God and the experience and help I received from Reverend Y, who happened to be the support person from the team. I found the courage to confess to her, and since that time she's acted as my advocate, believing my experience and believing the information that I have shared about Pastor X. I want to express my sincere appreciation for the role she's played in my life, for she has restored some of my faith in the United Methodist Church." So that was a testimonial statement. Another one. "Sexual exploitation is ugly and can even be compared to incest, since the church views itself as a family. And like most families where there is incest, it is often kept hidden in shame and secrecy. The church family itself is the ultimate victim broken apart by the action of a pastor. The church, during the healing process, usually becomes a place of fear and distrust. Members are pitted against other members, and what is not cared for under current policies are the broken spirits of ordinary, well-meaning people in a community of faith. In most cases of clergy sexual abuse, victims need protection, compassion, and many years to heal. In order for the victim to be vindicated, the offender must be confronted and made accountable for his or her actions to all church members as soon as possible after the complaint is made. Immediate action will help to heal those secret patterns of abusive behavior, dispel the rumors, and create a safe environment within the injured church to allow the process of healing to happen. In my case, the sexual exploitation by Reverend X was the most devastating experience I've ever known. My time in this exploitive relationship was 2 years. I now know that he exploited my mind first, before persuading me to enter into a sexual relationship. Initially, I went to him for counseling on some marital issues. He was extremely sympathetic to my inner turmoil and always offered an open door to more dialogue. He began to call me at work on the business of the church. And as time went on, the calls became interwoven with more personal issues about himself. He manipulated me by having me believe that I was his trusted friend and someone he could go to and felt safe with. He told me of his past involvements with other women and used this confidence to persuade me that I was not like the others. Soon he began to tell me that I was very attractive to him. One day after a wedding he officiated where I played the piano, and after everyone left the sanctuary, he took my hands in his and repeated marriage vows to me in front of the altar. As I now look back on this act, I see that was the most devastating of all. He and I shared our beliefs in God and that inner voice and comforter and good friend, and he introduced me to his belief in God as a lover, telling me that God wanted to care for us and that I could now be his lover in this relationship. As the relationship became sexual, he once served me communion immediately after we had had intercourse, telling me that God was blessing our time together. I loved him and I believed he loved me. For 2 years, he promised me we would be together, leaving our respective spouses. I finally could no longer tolerate the stress of the affair and gave him an ultimatum. He then confessed to his wife about our relationship and sent me an article titled "Soul Stealing: Power Relations in Pastoral Sexual Abuse," and in the note said that I was indeed his victim. It took time and some very intensive therapy for me to fully understand this. And after the relationship ended, I found out that I was very apprehensive any time I ever met a male pastor. When I entered into my church, I realized I could no longer pray or feel close to God. I was able to be supported by others who acted on my behalf to leaders in the denomination. So that's one person's story. Another woman, shortly following Reverend X's, and I say Reverend X, they're not all the same Reverend, Reverend X's arrival, he began making statements like, "Oh, what beautiful dark brown eyes you have. I could look at them all day. Oh, it's so hard for me to stay in the office when you work here." I was surprised by this, and my first reaction was just to laugh. This was a joke, right? But soon he told me about a person in the church who came to him regarding marital problems and told me what he advised that person to do. Friend or not, church secretary or not, him telling me this made no sense at all. For him to share something of a confidential nature with me was wrong. I feel that he used that situation to see if I was having any problems in my marriage. At different times, he would say things like, "Oh, you look tired today. Are you having a problem? What is it? You can tell me anything." Feeling that he was probing for a weak spot, I didn't share, but I truly believe he was looking for a way into my head. It's hard to describe, but it seems that if he couldn't get to me with his compliments or his voiced desire for me, he would look for another way in. After I learned of his other past improprieties and exploitations, I'm convinced beyond any doubt I could have been a sexually exploited victim if I had given him so much as one little flaw in my life. I'm not trained in this field. I don't have textbook knowledge, but I know how he made me feel. I know it wasn't my imagination. I know he was looking for more, and so I was his victim too. Reverend X had often expressed to me how he was viewed in the conference, that he was seen as a favorite son, and no one would believe me if I said anything. How could I have gone to my district superintendent after this to say I was harassed? It was my word against his. There was nothing that was black or white about this. He left me feeling very ambivalent and very distrustful of the church. There's an estrangement and a feeling of emptiness now when I walk in those doors. This was a man I basically trusted and believed in what he was saying in his Sunday messages, and now I knew he played with people's emotions and used friendships to boost his own ego. What disturbs me even more, I lost my place. What disturbs me even more is that this was all meant to go away quietly. It was like, well, what's done been done. Just let him leave and not deal with the feelings, the anger, the hurt, and talking to everyone else who'd been exploited. Who will listen to my one voice? I feel that he has been protected, and he's not known the true disappointment and pain that his actions have caused to others. How will I ever again trust a pastor? How will I ever believe what a pastor's saying? There are some things that Reverend X has taken from me. He was the man with the authority and the power. He was the pastor. So again, I share these just to give you a little sense of what we encounter when we hear the stories, and these could be multiplied many times. So a couple of things that surface in almost every case that we deal with. The relationship, too often, when it's between a male pastor and an adult female parishioner, whether or not they're married, often people see it as a consensual relationship. And one of the hardest things we do is educate folks in the congregation that it cannot be consensual when the pastor is in the position of power. It's an abuse of power. And that's one of the most difficult things people have to recognize in these situations. The other thing that we run against almost all the time is everyone wants to jump to forgiveness. Because after all, we're Christians and we're in the church. They want to jump to forgiveness without having any accountability or repentance on the part of the offender. And again, we spend a lot of time listening and sharing and talking and listening more to help people understand that you cannot have forgiveness if someone is not repentant and is not willing to take responsibility for their actions. and that no person who's been victimized should ever be told they must forgive their abuser. And so those are some of the things that we've learned. It's not easy, it's really difficult. But to offer forgiveness, it's that concept of cheap grace. If you offer forgiveness before someone has taken responsibility for their actions or has asked for that forgiveness. We've had a couple of churches who, because of the work we've done, have offered to go in and help other churches. And that's been really wonderful because they, out of their own experience, can say, the response team came and worked with us. Here's the value we found, and we want to help you have that same experience. So we do know there's been a lot of effective ministry that has happened over the years with this. Now, I don't know if I can get this. All right, so just some very brief slides to help reinforce a little bit about this. A response team is a group of persons, clergy and lay, men and women, called upon into action by the bishop or the bishop's designee. So we cannot go into a congregation until we're asked. And that has to come through the bishop or one of the district superintendents at the bishop's request. We are people who have training, expertise, and resources in specific areas of ministry. And we also have people who are trained in the complaint process. Marion mentioned about the Joint Review Committee. That was still in existence with the first couple of cases that I dealt with, but now the process has changed very much in the discipline about how these things. Back then, the Joint Review Committee, they couldn't even keep notes about what happened.
At the beginning of my time on Joint Review, there was no notes. At the end, we were recording everything.
Yeah, so it did change. And that first situation that I dealt with, the complaint actually was brought by the secretary of the church in a letter, not by the kind of primary victim. And so the secretary was asked to go before the Joint Review Committee, can't say that word, and she was not technically allowed to have a support person with her. The accused pastor was. And again, I'm like, no, I'm going with her. So I went with her and was supposed to not be able to talk. Well, they can't shut me up. Someone has to tell the truth. Someone has to be there to support this person. So again, that's all been changed. But that's what we were up against all those years ago. And I'm so glad that things have changed. So the complainant is the person who has signed a complaint against the offending pastor. These are technical terms, and you'll hear them again as you hear more about the process. The respondent is the pastor against whom the complaint has been filed. And we use this language so we don't talk about victim and perpetrator. So this is alternative language that we use to make it a little less adversarial. And the support person, they used to call that person an advocate, and now the language I use is a support person, the one who walks with the respondent through that process. And that's the role that I played a lot in those early years. Support person actively assists and supports the complainant of the clergy sexual misconduct through the denominational process, helps them understand it. The goal is to empower them to reclaim his or her own voice, to protect them from being re-victimized, works to reconcile the complainant to the congregation where possible, but often that does not happen. Often it is the complainant who ends up leaving the church and feeling unwelcome. We've learned a lot over the years, the importance of telling the truth. It's so essential to not cover it up, hide it, but telling the truth. We've learned about the power of an apology by a cabinet representative for the harm done. And it's not taking responsibility, but saying, we are so sorry this happened to you. The need for everyone involved to have a trained support person, and we also have a support person for the accused pastor. They don't always accept that help, but it is always offered, and we have people who've had some specific training to walk with the pastor through this process if they're willing to engage in the process. So it's again, we've had support people for church secretaries, for staff parish chairs, for anyone who is super involved in what's going on, for spouses of the accused pastor, for spouses of the person who is signing the complaint, for children. and teenagers who are in those families of either the pastor or the person who signed the complaint. So anyone who needs a support person, we will find someone who, from the team, who can walk the journey with that person. The role of the staff parish committee is very critical as leaders in the healing process, and we always engage them. The value of congregational meetings where folks can talk honestly about their feelings in small groups facilitated by the response team members. We've learned we can't take it personally when we become the target of the anger of the congregation, and that happens a lot. We've learned we have to be very patient and really listen a lot. No two cases are alike, although there's some common elements that run through most cases, but each one has its own uniqueness because there are unique people involved in every single case. We've learned the need to educate everyone about the abuse of power and that it's often at the root of the offending pastor's behavior. I think given the climate today, not only what's been happening with the revelations in the Catholic Church, but the whole Me Too movement. When Wendy was talking about people kind of being re-traumatized, when the Me Too movement began 2 years, it's been 2 years ago, I was beginning to see a whole lot of people having that kind of trauma surfacing again because of that. And we sometimes become almost secondary trauma victims in all of this because listening to these stories and being in these situations is not easy. We've learned the need to call the offending pastor to repentance and accountability. And then this is just where you can find the sexual ethics policy on the conference website, and there should be a copy in your binders of that. So this is kind of a long way to tell the story about why we are where we are now in terms of understanding how it began. Helps to put everything into context.
Kathy's going to talk to us a little bit about boundaries. And Kathy has done a magnificent job. We used to have basic boundaries and what we called boundaries 2. And folks would take the basic boundaries, which was really outdated. And then they were also required to take boundaries 2 within a 6-month period, right? When they were appointed. So Kathy combined them, and we did a trial run, which was really fun. But we're going to let Kathy talk about that a little bit.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so the information that existed, even though the basic boundaries material had some datedness to it, the information was really important. And the information that we had in the Boundaries 2 training was really important. And so since the sexual ethics policy is very clear that all persons who are serving in pastoral leadership in the church, so clergy, CLMs, laity who have been hired by the DS to serve in a church, everyone who is leading really needs to be faithful to this training. We wanted to make sure that we had the best. That's perfect, thank you. The best possible training to make that happen. Also in our sexual ethics policy, we have the requirement that every quadrennium, so in addition to that in the first 6 months, every quadrennium, persons who are serving in pastoral leadership in the church must take some sort of refresher training. And what we know is this: the information in the boundaries training is not new revelatory information. It's information we know, but we also know that pastors who wander, who find themselves involved in sexual misconduct, are pastors who don't heed that information that we already know somewhere within us when it comes to boundaries. And so we want to make sure that we are constantly refreshing and reminding ourselves what's appropriate. And my role as a clergy person in establishing, maintaining, and heeding appropriate boundaries. And so we know wanderers tend to be those who have isolated themselves and have tended to have poor self-care. And so this boundaries training that we now have, that we've tested on our group of guinea pigs, and I think have a plan for tightening up, what it covers is in 5 hours, a biblical foundation for boundaries, the role that the pastor has in power and authority. And one of the things that we just heard Sue talk about was how so often when misconduct happens in the local church, we have folks who kind of get confused with this understanding of, but it was mutual, it was consensual. And there might have been a sense of that, but that's not reality, because the pastor always has the power. The pastor always has the authority. And we have to be so very clear about that. I mean, one of the things that I've heard Elaine say is that even if a parishioner shows up naked in the pastor's office and throws him or herself at the pastor is still the one who is responsible for saying no, because it's still not consensual. Yes?
And sometimes the women that we have, because mostly it's been women, they don't even understand that. They think it's a consensual relationship because they don't even understand that power differential and dynamic. And it takes a while and some therapy usually for them to finally get it.
Exactly. And so this is something we want to make sure we really cement into our pastors' understandings. The other piece that we need to talk about is what sexual misconduct is and what sexual misconduct is not. Because again, sexual misconduct is not an affair. It is not something that happens consensually. It is misconduct. And the other piece that we want to make sure is happening in boundaries training is to again focus on the pastor's role and the pastor's responsibility. The conversation we don't want to have in boundaries training is, what does the person who is the victim in a situation need to do differently in order to stop the pastor from doing whatever the pastor is doing that's creepy. So in other words, I mean, we want to make sure that persons feel empowered to say no, but in boundaries training, we have to be so very clear so as to not muddy the waters, that a pastor isn't waiting for a parishioner to draw a line in the sand, because the pastor needs to be the one who does that. Is that clear? That it's the pastor's responsibility. So in our boundaries training now, what we have are some case studies that the participants work through and navigate what has happened, what needs to happen differently. We also have taken some of the best scenarios from that Ask Before You Hug video, and we're now having the pastors act those out. And I tell you, that really triggered a creep factor for me in watching them and watching some of our pastors really kind of live into some real creepy behavior. But to have our pastors actually be the misconducting pastor and then to debrief that as a group, I think is really very helpful. And then at the end of boundaries, we want to make sure that all of our pastors are walking away with an action plan for self-care. Because again, wanderers tend to be those who have not exercised appropriate self-care, and pastors tend to think that there's lots of urgent and pressing things in the schedule, and there are, but when we isolate, when we don't do things that meet our own needs, and we start to find those or look for those in inappropriate places like in the church, that's when wandering begins to happen. And then the other kind of action piece that we want to have at the end of the boundaries training is making sure that every pastor is able to name who are one or two people who would be close to them, that when a gray situation might seem to emerge, that here is somebody that I can process this with, that I will process this with, that there's accountability, and that this person will help me see maybe what's not so gray, or where there's a slippery slope, or where I need to be very careful in the decisions I make. Because when it comes to some of the scenarios, the real life situations that pastors find themselves in, there are aspects that really feel like they could be open to interpretation. And so since something could be open to interpretation, before it becomes inappropriate, before it becomes misconduct, who is my Elaine that I would go to and say, so I've got this situation, or who is the Elaine in my life who's going to say to me, Kathy, are you aware of? And how important it is that at the end of the day, that's part of the action plan that clergy have. So at this point, our status with boundaries is the requirement within the first 6 months, and we are working at the affirmation that this new training will be the required training, so we can have folks trained as facilitators. And we also, for our quadrennial fulfillment, will have this new required training that folks could retake. There's also, based on the safe sanctuaries it's like a, what is it? Virtual world, thank you. A Joy Melton book. Elaine and I have worked on a training that covers cell phones, social media, and supervision. So that can be used. And also at Wesley Seminary, through the Lewis Center, there are 2 online trainings that they have covering boundaries, and then I think also some virtual world pieces that fulfill the quadrennial for clergy who are serving after having taken the one that's required in the first 6 months. So this is the information on boundaries, but before we step away from this, do we have any questions? Yes, Donna.
The first one that they take, that has to be in person.
Yes. Yes, it has to be in person, and it will need to be facilitated by somebody who has been trained to facilitate the materials. Because one of the things that we have to be so very careful in the boundaries training is that when we're unpacking scenarios, we need to make sure that there is somebody speaking to anything that is kind of surfacing from the conversation that is alarming. So, for example, last week, when Elaine and I were watching one of the scenarios unfold, it was a scenario where a mentor pastor was working with a mentee pastor, and the mentee pastor was saying, I'm not so sure that I want to be engaged in, what we even did yesterday, even though you're saying I liked it, because the mentor pastor was really praying on the younger mentee pastor. And as we debriefed that, there was a lot of conversation around what did the mentee pastor need to do. And we want to empower pastors who would be in a situation like that to be able to speak up for themselves. But we were totally, as a group, missing the focus on the mentor pastor, the older pastor who was preying on, who was grooming, who was already engaging in misconduct with the younger mentee pastor. And so we need to make sure that our folks who are facilitating are watching for things like that to be able to speak into them and help keep things focused on the boundary setting that we need for our pastors to set. Yeah, Wendy.
Kathy, you used the term wonder a few times, and I wondered if you wanted to make a distinction between wonder
Yes, absolutely. So, and this is something that, side note, I think we need to talk about with the cabinet. Yes. Okay. So predators are exactly how they sound. Somebody who is really just exactly on the prowl. I mean, they are seeking out, and maybe in their own heads they're not saying victims, but to me that's exactly what they're doing. They are seeking out victims. A wanderer is someone who kind of slips down that slippery slope and finds him or herself in a situation that they didn't wake up in the morning thinking, you know, I'm going to engage in sexual misconduct. But just through a series of events and a series of saying yeses, that makes the situation kind of happen. And so this person becomes kind of a wanderer. They may not engage in misconduct again after that time. They found themselves by creating the situation of isolation, of not caring for themselves, of having some fulfillment happening through some other people, and so they just kind of wandered into it. So a predator is someone who is, that's what they're looking for.
And who will be a repeat offender.
Yes. And a wanderer oftentimes is someone who has just slid into it.
So boundaries training is not likely to help predators.
Right.
You know, the boundaries training is aimed more at the wanderers.
wanderer. Right. And
However, I was just going to say, however, as the case that Sue talked about, the one that went to trial, it helped us.
Yes.
You know, because even though that predator had no knowledge of, didn't absorb any of that, we did our due diligence, and so that's an important.
right, absolutely an important piece. And so there's other responsibility, I think, than when it comes to predators and how they're processed and handled.
Would you say that more of our cases, though, are people who have wandered across the boundaries than have been predators? I mean, we've had some huge cases with predators, but I'm thinking that probably in terms of the numbers of cases, we've had more cases of people wandering across boundaries.
You know, I don't know. I feel like,
Well, maybe 2/3, 1/3.
yeah, 2/3 predators.
Yeah, I think.
2/3 predators?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Most
That's
of it just
interesting.
handed in their credentials, they don't want to deal with it.
We don't have many that have been restored.
Yeah.
No, right.
Yeah,
That's
right.
true.
that's what I was thinking, because
So wanderers are more likely to be restored, is what you're saying?
there's a possibility for
There's a
wanderers to be
possibility.
restored, whereas with a predator,
Yeah.
I don't think it's appropriate to
No, it's
restore
not
a
even
predator. I mean, I just don't.
They
Because
don't
it's
fit
a
the criteria
disease.
for restoration.
If
We hope to screen them out, though, in the candidacy process, usually. I mean, the effort is made to identify people who would, you know, end up as predators. So we have, hopefully, fewer of them serving in ministry than we have people who are potential wanderers.
Right.
And if there's ever a situation where there's ever more than one victims, to use that word, they aren't even offered the restoration process. They're only offered the restoration process after they've been out of ministry for somewhere between 2 and 3 years, and they have to have a spiritual director, they have to go through counseling, they have to waive their right to confidentiality so that the counselor can report back to the board. And I mean, there's all these safeguards in place. So we've, to my knowledge, had 2 people restored back to ministry who were wanderers. One is still currently serving in a church. The other one, after a couple of years, I think he surrendered his credentials and just left
I think you retired.
They're retired. Because it also has to be disclosed to every congregation they're appointed, to the staff parish committee, that they have this complaint in their past and that it's been resolved, but there have to be safeguards put in place so that they're never tempted to wander again.
Okay, but they're not restored back to their original church, right?
No, never back to the original church.
Okay.
Never.
No.
I would say that would be,
No.
No.